Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Congressman Hank Johnson's four-day event of the 4-Series Grant Workshop for this week. This is the kickoff of his annual Week of Hope. I'm Eric Hubbard, his District Outreach Director, and on behalf of the Congressman, we want to welcome everyone to a wonderful week, and we hope that you will be able to get something out of the workshop for this week. Today is day one, grant writing, how to write a grant proposal. You will be able to find out how to write grants and also how to best apply the skills that you have obtained today into your organization. At this time, I would like to welcome our host, our Congressman Hank Johnson, who will go ahead and tell you about this week he has lined up for you. Have a good day, everyone, and let's have a good workshop. Congressman Johnson.
Thank you, Eric, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Congressman Hank Johnson, representing Georgia's 4th Congressional District, and I'd like to welcome you to the kickoff series of my annual grants workshop. I'd also like to welcome you to the first day of our Week of Hope in honor of National Nonprofit Day, which is August 17th. An entire week has been dedicated to nonprofit organizations for your service to our communities. HOPE is an acronym that I created that stands for Helping Other People Elevate. That is essentially why we have been summoned to serve, embarking on something that is much bigger than ourselves. It's ultimately a calling. It's meant to encourage, to inspire, and to uplift those who are unable to elevate themselves. It is for those who have hit rock bottom and cannot see a way up, for those who are destitute and are unfortunately persona non grata. Nonprofit organizations such as yours have played a significant role in our communities for a very long time, and your role in humanity became even more prevalent once we were hit with the pandemic in 2020. Many folks were laid off, their jobs and food insecurity became common, even among those who once had a stable income. As the housing market continues to soar and the costs of rent skyrocketing, nonprofit organizations have stepped up to assist those with food, shelter, and behavioral health services, faith, education, and the list goes on. There are many nonprofits that are operating day to day to aid others, but have never received federal grants, and I believe that needs to change. Without financial resources, nonprofit organizations and municipalities are limited in the amount of help that they can provide. The number one reason most have never submitted a grant application is simply because they have little to no knowledge on how to write a grant proposal. I hope that today marks the beginning of changing that. I'd like to welcome and thank Dr. Kimberly Jo Eck, Associate Vice President of Research at Emory University, for her time. And I hope that today's workshop will provide you with the necessary tools to write a successful grant proposal so that your organization can begin to receive a federal grant funding. Dr. Eck, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Congressman. It is a pleasure to be here with you all. I'm so excited. We have over 270 participants on the line. And huge thank you to your office. I love that acronym, HOPE, Helping Other People Elevate. And I'm thrilled to be able to be a part of this week and really kick it off. So I would be delighted if everyone asks lots of questions. You can put them in that Q&A box down below. And I'm going to share my screen here. Now, to help me understand what you want to hear most about, we're going to ask a few polls. So I'd love for your responses as those polls come up so that I get a better understanding of the 280 mystery folks who are on the line right now. I know many of you are from nonprofits, but I really want to get in a little bit more detail to understand what you're most interested in or what you have the most questions about. We're going to save the Q&A for the end so that, because we do have a number of people on the line, so that we can get to the most asked questions or the most upvoted or the ones that seem to have the broadest implication. And so we'll get to that at the end of today's session. I'm going to share my screen so that we can get started here. All right, here we go. Haha, there we are. All right, there's me. That time, a bit professional straight hair. I love it. Okay, my MPH and PhD is in epidemiology, epidemiology, that we all know that word now. I've spent over 14 years in securing external funding, especially federal grants. And then down at the bottom, I listed some of the alphabet soup of all of those agencies that I have worked with, and there's even a few more. In previous roles, I've worked at a small consulting firm. I've worked for healthcare system. I've worked for the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. I've even been the president of the National Organization for Research Development Professionals that brings everybody who has a role like mine together from across the US, all of us aimed at generating resources for our institutions. Currently, I'm the Associate Vice President for research at Emory, and I'm also the director of the Nordics Consultant Program, which is dedicated to diversifying the research ecosystem by providing research development services to minority serving and emerging research institutions. I think very much aligned with the idea behind that HOPE theme. With the Nordic Consulting Program, I've partnered with the National Science Foundation to support MSIs and ERIs submitting applications to the NSF, enabling partnerships to increase innovation capacity. So I even have some experience actually partnering with federal agencies. Okay, let's get started with our first poll. Candace, if you can launch the poll for me, that would be fantastic. Participants are now seeing a question. What are you most interested in learning about today? I've got some suggestions on there for you to respond to. Or it might be, maybe it's something else. Maybe it's something else I didn't even think about. So go ahead, enter your response. We're going to keep that up there for about 30 seconds, and then we'll see what our results are. All right, Candace, when you think that we've got a pretty good representation of those who are on the line responding, you can go ahead and show results. Ooh, finding funding, a big one. Tips for writing the grant proposal. That makes sense since this session is called Writing Grant Proposals. Those are our top two, and we will definitely talk about that. Great. We are going to hit so many of these topics that you've identified. And the people who are here just for fun, heck yes, that's awesome. You didn't think that I had a pom-pom over there, but I did. All right, let's keep going. Okay. This is how I'm going to structure our conversation today. I'm going to do just a tiny intro about federal agencies to give you a little bit of context and positioning, so that will help inform our conversation about finding funding and understanding the anatomy of an RFP, how to really read a request for proposal. Then I'm going to talk about that go, no-go decision. By go, no-go, I mean, are we going to apply? Do we feel like we meet the criteria for eligibility? Do we feel like we can perform the services required? Or are we not going to apply? Because there are many reasons to not apply or to apply. And then we're definitely going to spend a lot of time talking about writing. So I have a number of tips that are applicable to many different types of grants, which I think will be really helpful. And of course, we are going to touch base on the budget and supplemental docs a little bit, just to make sure that you have some familiarity with all of those extra pieces that go along with that main narrative that you're usually talking about. Okay, federal agencies, super quick intro here. There are 26 grant-making federal agencies, and each agency has a unique mission, and they can vary greatly by their grant-making in terms of size and the types of grants they support and how much funding they have to give out. Funding for grants, this is like the 10-second version of how it works. The budget planning begins a year before the budget is to go into effect. Federal agencies create budget requests and submit them to the White House Office of Management and Budget. OMB refers to the agency's requests as it develops the overall budget proposal for the president. The president submits the budget proposal to Congress early in the next year. Proposed funding goes to the subcommittees, they hold hearing, they come back with all sorts of resolutions and recommendations. The House and Senate come up with their own. Eventually, they have to be merged together. And both must pass a single version of each funding bill. And then Congress sends the approved funding bills to the president to sign or veto. That's the 30-second version. It is so complicated. There's so many intricate steps in there. But if it were a smooth process that could be described in 30 seconds, that would be it. Now, there are many different types of federal grants, and this isn't an official listing. This is to help me get a better understanding about what you all are interested in. So there's research, that's traditional research conducted by individual investigators based on traditional research methods. It might also include research-related career programs, and it can also include that SBIR, STTR program meant for small businesses. Services like healthcare delivery, social or other types of services, treatment and rehabilitation programs, education and information about those types of programs as well. Training grants, which might be for health professionals or agricultural professionals, could address workplace safety and many other topics. Or other, that might be a construction grant, infrastructure, maybe planning and development or evaluation. So poll, if we can launch that now, I'd like to understand which type of grant you're most interested in. And over 320 participants on the line now. Wow, that is fantastic. All right, and Candace, when do you think we've got a pretty good representative sample of responses, you can close that poll. Services, okay, loud and clear, services, I got it. I know which direction to go. Fantastic, thank you for that information. And we will keep going, keep it in mind. We are thinking about services. We wanna know about finding funding. We wanna know about grant writing. Okay, now this is for your reference at some time when you've got an afternoon free and you can click on some links. Remember I mentioned the 26 grant making funding agencies? Well, here they are listed, they're all linked. Now, some of these are huge. So the Department of Health and Human Services, ginormous. That includes ARPA-H, NIH. It also includes HRSA, SAMHSA, ACL. There are a lot of agencies embedded under that department. So that'll take some time to browse around. National Endowment for the Arts, a little bit more straightforward. So depending, I'm going to reference this as we move into finding funding. So I wanted you to have a little bit of context because I think it's important to understand what the federal agency's missions are in order to help you find funding, especially if you're just starting out. Okay, so this is my intro to finding funding. Once you know, did I miss a slide? No, okay. So this is where I think you should start. You want to know which agency you're most aligned with. And that sometimes can be really challenging to figure out. That's why I gave you all those links at first, because as you start to think about a project that you are looking for funding for, the easiest way to then, before you start reading RFPs, which we will talk about, but before you even start reading RFPs or the details of every single funding opportunity that that agency has to offer, it's really useful to figure out which is your best fit. NIH tends to not so much support services, they're really more traditional research as a general rule of thumb. HRSA and SAMHSA are going to be more generally supporting services and not so much research. The National Endowment for the Arts is really going to be supporting arts, community engagement with arts, community arts projects, and fellowships that support artists in some ways. So if you can figure out which funding agency using all those links you most fit with, that is the most useful place to start, I think, when looking for federal funding opportunities. Then once you know that agency, you want to start looking for the directorate or the branch or the division to help understand how you can navigate in their world, how they're structurally organized. Some agencies are more complicated than others, but if you can narrow it down to the directorate or branch or division or section within that agency, now you're really close. Now you're getting much, much closer to who that potential funder can be. So first, when you figure that out, and that'll take some time, it might take some looking around, talking to others who work in your sector to understand maybe where they get funding from, that can help. But you can find a lot of this online. They all have their missions and their structure of their organization published. Then subscribe to their listserv. So that's where you really start hearing about funding opportunities. And they are going to come out regularly. It varies greatly from agency to agency. Some do a more intentional job of announcing new funding opportunities on their listserv. Others might be more focused on announcing their awardees or the achievements of their awardees, but that's really helpful. Either side of that coin can really help you understand what types of organizations are being supported and the types of projects that they're being supported to do. So that'll give you even a little bit more flavor of that particular agency and even some of those subdivisions in that agency regarding what they really support. Now, where else can you find funding opportunities besides looking at the subscribing to their listserv? There's a number of places. So grants.gov is the coordinating center where all of the 26 grant making agencies push their new federal solicitations, and they are announced there generally as either simultaneously to or before they're announced on these other platforms. But it's all of them. It's all of the 26 grant making agencies. And it is typically only new solicitations. Some of the agencies run everything through solicitations, and some of the agencies use a combination of features, including reoccurring or parent or project descriptions that don't necessarily generate a new solicitation. So know that grants.gov does have all new solicitations, but there are other mechanisms through which agencies can put out funding. And so it's this little quirk with grants.gov, but there's a lot to sort through because it's all of those agencies. And so if you have grants.gov and you know which agency you're most aligned with and your project concept is most aligned with, you can sort out all of the other agencies and just check grants.gov whether you're going to do that once a week or you want to do it more frequently, like once a day or something like that. You can sort out all of the directorates or the agencies that are probably not closely aligned with you and focus on those that are coming out from your agency that you're most aligned with. Some other opportunities come out through the System for Award Management, which is formerly Fed BizOps. These are also wide-ranging in the topics they address. Some are going to be about research, some are going to be about procuring 50,000 computers, and some maybe might align occasionally with what you're wanting to do. It varies greatly, and so if you are subscribed to your agency's listserv that's most closely aligned to you, you're watching grants.gov, you can also sort the contract opportunities on the SAM system and narrow it down to the agency that you're most interested in. And depending on the agency, that might come up a lot or it might not come up very much at all for you. There are many subscription services that I wanted to acknowledge, like Pivot or Grant Forward. These are really helpful. Many institutions of higher ed use them a lot because we have many people in our organization who are looking for all different types of funding, and subscribing as an organization makes sense at the scale of Emory or another large research institution of higher ed. It may not make sense for a smaller nonprofit who is just starting out in grant seeking, which again is why I'm emphasizing matching to your agency that is probably going to be the one that most likely fund types of projects that you're interested in is a really good place to start and to start looking at what kind of opportunities are out there. Okay, so then this is the masterclass. We're doing grant one-on-one, but I'll just sneak peek a little other piece of information. Formally, requests for proposals are slightly different from requests from applications, which are slightly different from notices of funding announcement or program announcement or a dear colleague letter or a notice of intent or a notice of special interest. There's so many, but guess what? Everybody just calls them RFPs. I mean, colloquially, if you're talking to somebody else who's looking at what kind of funding is coming out, almost everybody calls it an RFP, or maybe they'll call it generically a solicitation. So that's the masterclass little tip today. Okay. So now we got to talk about the anatomy of the RFP. So once you've now gotten into, okay, I think I might want to apply to something and I want to open that really long document that has all sorts of instructions and eligibility and compliance notes and so many things in it. How do I understand what they're asking for? What are the key pieces to look for in an RFP? And then how ultimately leading to how do I decide whether or not I want to apply? So this is what, when I teach my graduate students about grant seeking, this is what I tell them to look for to start. This is the basics of the proposal. And if you can answer these questions, you've answered at least half to 2/3 of what you need to answer before you really decide, okay, this is something I want to seriously consider applying for. So the first is funder, and then purpose and eligibility. If there's any kind of stages of the application, sometimes they have you start a letter of interest or a pre-proposal before they invite you forward. It's helpful to know about that. The due date and the budget. So these things are actually, the document is very long. Some of these RFPs can be 50, 60, 70 pages or more. And I'll show you here with some clips of an actual RFP that you only really need to read a few sections that are usually pretty well labeled to get this initial information to start down this path of evaluating whether or not this is a potential fit for you. And I'll remind everybody, go ahead and drop Q&A questions into the Q&A box, and we will end up answering those towards the end. Okay, so here we go. All right. So first, funder, usually right on the front cover. You didn't even have to read past line 1, right there, super bold. Okay, so we know who the funder is. HRSA is going to be the funder for this particular RFP. I just pulled one at random from grants.gov a few weeks ago, and this was on there. This is a service area competition, which is the funding piece behind some federally qualified health centers. This is their kind of 330 base grant. So we know the funder is HRSA. We see on the cover, due date right there. Got it, September 18th. Now we also see there's a supplemental info due date. And so we know there's some kind of 2-stage process where we submit the application, and then we are allowed a little bit more time to submit the supplemental funding. Okay, that's interesting. And then where do we find the rest of the information? We don't have to go too far into the document. We've got purpose on page 1. It's labeled as purpose there. It basically says fund health centers. And then it talks about the funding and budget. Now, this is a little bit different than you'd see in a lot of, on page 5, that is. A little different than what you'd see on many other kinds of RFPs. Here, the summary of funding, they tell you this very specific number. $235,291,792. It's like very, very specific. Usually you get a number that says 235 million, it's an even number. This is very specific. And the reason it's very specific is because the history of this kind of funding program, you have to look back at what was funded for a particular geographic region and sometimes specialty population in the past. And they all have very specific amounts. And the sum of those amounts that they're recompeting here total up to this 235 million number. So what they say in this paragraph is go look at this spreadsheet that we have linked here, look at the geography that you're interested in competing in, and that very specific budget number, which is actually the expenditures from previous awardees, that's what you're allowed to request. That's kind of a unique one, but you see it's labeled under the summary of funding, and then there's a link where you can go and look up which geography you're talking about. And then a couple pages later, page 7 very clearly spells out the eligibility information. Basically, are you a healthcare center is what they would like to know. That's really the core of what they're asking about there. And that's it. We've got all of the basic pieces to understand, am I eligible? What is this funding for? That's the purpose. And what are some key considerations, the due date, the budget, and who the funder is. So it looks like, or this huge document, but really in the first 7 pages, we found all of that key information. And that is true for many RFPs. You're going to see that those really critical pieces listed very early on, and pay extra attention to them to figure out if you're eligible and does the purpose match what you are trying to do. Then we move into the questions that are a little bit trickier to pull out. They're going to be definitely embedded deeper in the document. But once you get through those first few items, you're now looking for what I call threshold issues. These are pieces of information that are going to answer the question, should we apply for this? Should we bother investing our time in preparing an application or not? Is there a reason that we shouldn't do that? And so this could be factors that influence your organization's ability to perform the work that's related. So it might be the scope that they're requesting, could be timing, could be plenty of other things that might impact your organization's ability to do what they're asking for. Aspects that might make it difficult for your organization to meet all the requirements. So that could be things like matching funding or activities or allowable budget items. If there are certain things that aren't allowed and that would prevent you from being able to complete the project, you would want to identify those as soon as possible. And then considerations related to organization's competitiveness. That would be really important for you as an organization to consider whether or not you should be applying. For this, you get most of these answers from about 3 sections. You want to look at the background. What is usually an RFP is going to have some background that is explaining why this funding opportunity is coming out. That might be something like a special report that was created from the national academies or from the agency itself or from a working group that wasn't related to the agency, but the agency thinks is very important background, sets the context for why they're putting out this new funding opportunity. You also want to look at the project narrative. So the purpose is going to summarize what the project is about, but in the project narrative, they're going to give you more hints about what the agency is looking for. And so in the project narrative, they're giving you instructions about what to write. And if they didn't mention in the purpose that you need to have a robust evaluation capability, it might be mentioned in the project narrative, and that might inform your ability, your organization's ability to really meet all of the requirements, depending if you can contract that out or you have someone in-house, for example, to do the program evaluation. So as you read through the instructions of what to write, you're going to pick up on some more of those considerations. And then the review criteria. The review criteria always reveals a little bit more about what the agency is thinking and what they're emphasizing. Different agencies do a better job of making the review criteria very closely tied to the narrative instructions. And some agencies don't do a fantastic job of that. So sometimes you'll read the review criteria and it's so closely aligned to the project narrative instructions that there's really nothing new there. But a lot of times in the review criteria, there'll be another perspective or another key requirement that maybe isn't as explicitly spelled out other places in the document. So if I was going to summarize generically, that background, project narrative, and review criteria are going to be the sections of the RFP that really reveal whether those threshold issues that will inform whether or not your organization should apply. Now, if you want to do the masterclass, this is 101, but if you want to do the masterclass, you might also consider who currently has this award. If it's something that's being reissued, like this service area competition is mostly a recompete of all of those different geographies. And you, in addition to who currently has the award, you might think about who is likely to compete. And that could also lead you to a question around, well, should we lead or should we partner? And sometimes for organizations, as they're entering federal grant making or grant seeking and expanding their work in grant seeking, the who is likely to compete is a different way of saying, is our organization the right one to do this work, to fulfill this project? And that's just a kind of a different shade of that question. And I'll talk a little bit more then in the writing discussion about how you explain your organization's differentiators, for example. Okay. So we've captured these threshold issues. We've got our basic understanding of what the RFP is. We've captured these threshold issues. And now we're going to make a go, no-go decision. And so are we going to apply? Different organizations and different people have different philosophies on submitting proposals. And if you have a philosophy on submitting a proposal, I'd like to get a sense of how aggressive or cautious this group overall is. And so poll 3 can launch. What is your philosophy on go, no-go decisions? And then I'll tell you what mine is. And so I have some prompts there for you in terms of what your organization's philosophy might be. And I'm interested to see, you might not have developed a philosophy yet. That's okay. I'm interested to see how aggressive or how cautious you are. All right, as we're waiting for the poll to close, I see this. Is this also for students entering college? Generally, no. And I'm emphasizing the nonprofit approach in this session. Okay, let's close that poll and see what the results are. All over the place. Okay. If you have a high probability of winning, if you have strong insights into the program, if I can make a strong application regardless of the odds, my workload and due date is reasonable, if I'm eligible. They're all the folks who are like, if I'm eligible, I'm applying. But that is, they're going to get it. We have really the full spectrum here. And I tend to be right in the middle. If you can make a strong application, you should apply regardless of the odds. If there's going to be 1 in the country, 4 in the country, you can make a strong application, apply. There are things that I'm eligible for that I don't necessarily apply for. All right, we've got the full spectrum. All right, that's pretty cool. Let's see here. Okay, so go, no go. You've identified the threshold issues. And, as I had said on that previous slide, these are factors influencing your organization's ability to perform the work requested, aspects that could make it difficult, considerations related to your organizational competitiveness. Once you've got those summarized, the process forward then really depends on your organization. Some are really complex, some are not so complex, but really, to me, the couple of next steps that are really important are know who needs to weigh in. And if we need to make a critical decision, I might write up a brief that explains that basic information that I captured from the RFP and those really key threshold issues. And then we might circulate that to some of our leadership to say, hey, here's the pros and cons of applying for this. Should we do it? And if I'm sending it, if I know who needs to weigh in, I'm going to send it to those really key people and ask them to weigh in a decision or discuss with me what they want to do, and then make a decision and stick to it. So that's where it can get a little tricky as you dive deeper into actually responding to an RFP, or the opposite, not responding to the RFP. And it is challenging to switch lanes midway through. And so I definitely recommend, once the decision is made, that you consider it final and move on, and figure out, or make sure that you've got the threshold issue discussion up front, so that people can understand what they're committing to or not committing to, or how competitive they might be, and then make that decision and go from there. Okay, so we're going to get into the actual writing part, and this will be a little bit more in depth on some very specific tips and some larger overall tips. And so, which aspect of grant writing makes you the most nervous? I will be sure to spend a little bit of extra time in that section if I know what it is. Let's launch that poll. All right. Ooh, okay. Writing the project narrative, that is top of mind for folks, and a few other pieces as well. So folks who are here for fun are also, I'm not nervous. Should I be? Excellent. Very good. Okay, we got it. Project narrative. We'll definitely spend some extra time on that. Okay, so I have some general writing tips. This can absolutely be applied to that core project narrative. I use it a lot there. I use it in a few other places too. So some of these general tips on this slide and the next slide are applicable in a few different places, but definitely the project narrative. Okay, so very importantly, follow the instructions. I know it seems like I shouldn't have to say that, but you will have your boss one day coming to you telling you to put things in the grant that it's not asking for, and you'll have to say, you know what, Dr. Eck told us to follow the instructions and this is not in there. So there are some grant applications that are highly prescriptive. The solicitation has a lot of instructions about how long you can spend in terms of how many pages for different sections of your project narrative, 2 pages here, 1 page here, 1 page here. And they very specifically order it in a certain way. And they might give you, these page restrictions in certain ways. They're going to tell you what font size to use. And they might also be telling you exactly which services they want an organization to apply or to perform. Those are very specifically follow those instructions as they're written and as you believe the federal agency has intended you to write them. Don't worry, there'll be an info session. Many federal agencies, when they put out a new solicitation or it's time to recompete a solicitation, they often advertise an information session. And that's where they will most likely address any of those writing questions that might come up about the particular instructions. And so sometimes it's not clear exactly what they're looking for, and usually they'll respond in an open forum. They might also ask you to submit questions for advance, and that is a good place to submit those kind of questions. So you really want to follow the instructions. And if it's not clear, ask them in one of those forums where they're doing an info session, or they're asking you to send in questions and putting out an FAQ document. Usually for those highly prescriptive ones, you don't provide an intro or other information if they didn't ask for it. And I know someone that you're working with who's reviewing your writing is going to say, don't we need to introduce ourselves in the first paragraph and tell them about our organization? No, not if they didn't ask for it that way. Many of the highly prescriptive solicitations are going to ask for your organizational capacity statement at the end. And that is always odd feeling when you're saying you're going to do all these services and perform all this work, but your organization isn't even introduced until 20 pages into your document. That is normal. Provide the information where they ask for it. And if they don't ask for it, you probably don't need to provide it unless it's absolutely critical in order to understand your response in some way. So one of the number one things I see people do who are unfamiliar with that organizational structure is they'll try to add their organizational description up front when it is often requested at the end. That's my tip. Follow instructions. I know. But it has to be said. You will end up having to tell someone else that that's not what the instructions said. So use TK to write quickly early on. TK is journalistic shorthand for information to come. I use this frequently in grants that I'm supporting or preparing or leading the drafting of. And it is helpful in a couple of reasons. It allows you to kind of just start going. Like if you're staring at a blank page and you're not sure where to start, if you stop and look up that data or look up that reference or say, well, is it 25 or 20 of the population that we work with meets a particular criteria or a particular emphasis that the agent, don't add in anything at that time. Don't stop to work it up. Keep going, keep writing, and insert this TK. If you insert some other kind of placeholder like add number or insert name, it's harder to go back and find and fill in. TK doesn't commonly appear next to each other in the English language. And so it's very easy to find the specific spots where you have left this note to yourself to go back and add it in, as opposed to saying something like insert name, insert number, look up number. Then you're always trying to look for all these different words. And when I'm reviewing grants for a federal agency, there's always one during the panel that has things like insert name still left in the document that they submitted because it wasn't readily findable or wasn't easy to find because they didn't use my handy dandy tip of using this TK language. I think it's helpful to focus on writing and really structure your argument that you're making. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a section. But structuring the argument that you're trying to make, especially in one of those background sections, or sometimes they call it a needs statement within a lot of the service-oriented types of grant applications, you really want to structure that argument before you get distracted looking up a bunch of numbers. Because if you have a really solid argument, you spend a lot less time re-editing and re-editing and re-editing because you've got that really nice structure, and you'll also have very targeted go look up that reference requests because you already know that argument that you're trying to make. Now, as you're making that argument, quantify. That's especially in that needs statement, organizational capacity statement, as well as work plan. It is essential in the work plan. So numbers make it feel real. Use numbers whenever possible. That might be, numbers, fractions, percentiles, phrases that are helpful, or number one, leading, top 5, top 10, most, highest, second only to, whatever. So examples, you could say cardiovascular disease is a major cause of death, true, but you can use quantification to have that statement become more impactful. Cardiovascular disease is the number 1 cause of death. So we moved from major cause to number 1 cause of death. That would really clearly articulate through that number by quantifying it that this is a really important topic. Similarly, many Americans are overweight or obese, becomes nearly 2/3 of Americans. We will recruit several community partners. You want to get as specific as possible. We will recruit 5 community partners, or at least 5 or more than 5. It gives it a little bit more weight. It feels like you've thought through the process, you really know what you're doing, or you're emphasizing the importance of something. And so quantify wherever you can. But if you need to go look up the number, put it in as a placeholder, TK, and then once you're finished drafting and you've organized that structure, or at least you're at sort of a substantial draft, maybe it's not complete, go look it up then, but put that structure in as a placeholder so you know to come back to it. Now, my next general tip, which is really important whenever you're applying, is to know the reviewers. Now, there's different degrees of knowing the reviewers, because some are always kept confidential and others are a little bit more known. So some review panels really are public and they have every single person in their institution listed. Many are not, but you can hopefully get a sense of who the reviewers are and what the review criteria is. And sometimes as you start to enter the realm of grant seeking and grant funding, you will hear from people, oh, that they served on a panel for the service area competition. Often those that are funded end up being asked to serve on those review panels. And so you might not know who everyone is, but a lot of times you will start to know the type of people that they invite because they're funded, or you'll hear from others at meetings and other types of conferences that so-and-so served on a review panel. And it's helpful to think about, okay, well, what are their priorities? What might they be emphasizing? What might they be looking for? How do these people probably approach the review criteria? So if you know them specifically, fantastic. If you don't know them and you don't know who they are, that's okay. What you should assume then in that case is that reviewers have never heard of your organization, regardless of how long-standing it is, regardless of how important it is in the community. They've never heard of your organization before. The federal competitions are national. You could have 10 people from California reviewing your Atlanta-based program, and maybe they've never been to Atlanta. Maybe they've never even traveled to the Southeast. You have to assume that the reviewer doesn't know your organization. And so using some of the tips that I just mentioned about quantifying and really explaining the importance of or positioning of your organization is necessary. And then also assume that they maybe have never heard of your city or community, or don't know anything about it, don't know anything about the demographics, don't know anything about its history, don't know any of the why. And it's really up to you to describe that to them in the needs statement, organizational capacity, and also the work plan as a part of that. Some agencies really restrict the reviewer's perspective from the 10, 20, 30 pages that you give them. Other agencies allow a little bit more discussion about the reviewer's understanding of your community or organizational reputation, or your individual reputation as a PI, a principal investigator or program director. It depends on the agency very much, how much they allow that other type of insight to come into the discussion. So when in doubt, make sure you put it in those 10, 20, 30 pages that you are actually submitting. Because if you don't explain it there, if you don't say that you've won certain awards, if you don't say that your community demographics and needs look like this, they may not know. And so it's critical that you add that very clearly to your project description as you're drafting it. Now, the other thing here is some reviewers may not even be familiar with your field, which is really interesting. Occasionally, many agencies do often bring back those who are funded by the agency to be reviewers. But sometimes they go far beyond, and they often go far beyond those who have been funded. And for example, you might have individuals in that service area competition that are health centers, but maybe there is an evaluative part to it. And so they bring in an evaluation expert who doesn't necessarily have deep expertise in community health centers. And that evaluation expert might specifically be looking at the evaluation plans, great, but you need to explain to somebody who is an expert in evaluation what your organization is and how you do the things that you do, because they may not be familiar with how a community health center operates. So there's a lot of perspectives to consider when you're building that section of the narrative, like need statement or organizational capacity. And it's also why one of my top recommendations is that you get someone who's not either closely connected to the project from within your organization or someone external to your organization to actually read the proposal once you finish drafting it. Okay, so know your differentiators. This is very much a part of the organizational capacity section. And there's elements of this that can also cross into your community or needs statement as well. So differentiators. These are things that set your organization apart from others. And remember that masterclass that we talked about earlier? It's the same masterclass here. If you can anticipate your competitors, then you can help define what those differentiators are. And you want to echo them throughout the proposal in a thoughtful and brief way. You don't want to have an entire paragraph dedicated to differentiators on every page, but it is helpful to have a few key words that reference back to those differentiators. And differentiators sound like we are the only, we are the largest, we're the oldest, we're the best, we're the primary, we serve the most or the majority, or we're among the top 10. And where you're basing that can be different. Like you might say, we're the only organization in Southeast Atlanta, but there's other parts of Atlanta. That's okay, you're still saying a true thing, but you're helping the reviewer understand why you're important. And then the win themes are connected to your differentiators, but they can sometimes bring in other pieces like the target population or community that you are serving. They might also address weaknesses head on by inverting it. And so there was recently a project that a proposal that I was doing some writing on, and we addressed one of our weaknesses head on because as a consortium that was forming, we didn't have experience doing the exact thing that they were asking us to do, but we had a lot of relevant experience. And we knew some of our competitors would have experience in doing that exact thing. And so we said, we are unencumbered by decades-long history of inefficient processes. And that was one of our key differentiators, that it wasn't that we had no experience, it was that we were really unencumbered by these inefficient processes that we felt like a competitor would be raising. And so that's a strategy if you are, if you're really trying to think through how a direct competitor might be lining up with you. And that was a very direct competitor that we had a lot of intel about. So I'm going to talk through an example here. I was working on a proposal, and I knew that some of my competitors were going to be people proposing to create a brand new program with no track record in the same niche that I was working in. I also knew that some for-profit consultancies with experience performing similar work were going to be applying. And whether or not that was under the umbrella of a nonprofit or somehow connected to another organization, I wasn't sure at the time. Some for-profit. And then I also knew that people proposing to hire consultants would be a similar strategy to what I was doing, but I could name them and they were already vetted. They couldn't name them and didn't know who they were yet, so they couldn't put them through kind of any process yet. So the differentiators that I ended up using in my proposal were that I was the only currently operating program in this niche nationally. So that was, okay, if you're going to create a new program, I'm the only one that has been running this. The service is exclusively provided but with external funding, and they can't be bought unless it's through external funding. And so that was targeting the for-profit consultants. You can't buy this. We only operate with grant funding. And we use vetted consultants. Here's their names, here's their bio listed. I spent a lot of real estate in the proposal listing the actual names of the individuals that were already vetted and a part of this program. And that was pretty good. Then my win themes were, so they're related, but they're expanding on it a little bit more, were that my program was successfully piloted and we had lessons learned. We had really positive early results, and the activities and results emphasize sustainable changes. So I said sustainable a lot. I also, after each major section, I would say this process was successfully piloted. And I said that about 5 times throughout the document, a very short sentence. It's literally what it said. This process was successfully piloted, to really drive home the point that I was the only one currently operating a program in this particular niche nationally. And that there was no one else that could say the same, and that they had de-risked and really vetted and demonstrated feasibility of the program. So that's like a real world example of how I would work in my understanding of the competitors and how that connected to my differentiators and my win themes. So that's a lot of thinking before you actually begin typing anything on paper. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the statement of need, or this might be a statement of significance. And I spent more time here on the writing so that, because that was an important part of what you all were looking for. And then I'll just summarize some of these extra pieces that get into some of the later sections. And so as you're writing, you really want to make that funnel where you're starting with the biggest geography or the most dramatic endpoint, and you're moving that into smaller geographies or less severe upstream endpoints, where you're able to explain this is how this proposal is really affecting your community, and how the services that you're going to offer are going to make that better. And so where I have that gap there in 5, 6, and 7, studies or previous initiatives, they don't have to be necessarily formal studies, but you can explain this was going on and it stopped, or it didn't address these needs that my program is going to address. And here we are, we're going to do this. And so making that connection to, there's a lot of significant, important need here in my community. Other initiatives have attempted to address that, but didn't quite get to the goal endpoint. And I think my organization can. Here's how I'm going to fill that gap. And at the end of the project, we'll know this, or we will have served 3,000 people, or we'll be able to improve health, or whatever your target endpoint is. Now, this is a work plan template that I'm happy to share with the Congressman's office to send out to you. I think probably the most useful part of this template is actually getting your hands on the real template. And the way I organize my work plans is to really anchor them to goals and have the objectives and activities really flow through the goals. So I say the goals are the organizing structure, and the objectives should be the major milestones in support of the goal, and the activities are more of the baby steps. And I also have a handout on activities, outputs, and outcomes, like how could you possibly be evaluating some of these things. This was originally developed as a part of my NSF funded collaboration, and I'm happy to share this with you as well to help you think about how you might be drafting your evaluation plan. And here's a little bit more about how you might draft that evaluation structure. It all comes in the same document that I'm happy to share with you. And so the supplemental docs, I will just touch on logic models so you can see how that connects to the evaluation. And here's the typical structure of a logic model with inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, which can be short-term and midterm. A lot of times you see those separated, sometimes they summarize them together, and then impact, which is sometimes called long-term outputs. Impact, that's your goals. If you wrote goals in your work plan, they go in impact. If you have outcomes, those are typically your objectives, and outputs are usually connected directly to those activities. and the people that you're proposing are going to work on this from your organization, or you might be hiring. You can put other things in input like specific facilities or resources. It's obvious that you're seeking funding because you're applying for a grant. You don't need to list that there. A lot of times it ends up being people, the people who are working on this project. So the people are going to do activities. If they're going to run 3 outreach events, you might say that there's 3 events, and each event, maybe your goal is targeting 100 people. So you're going to have 300 people. And then whatever objective that rolls up to might be increasing knowledge or something like that. And then listing your goals. Those 2 pieces, your work plan and your logic model and your evaluation plan, need to be very closely connected. So I have some other information here, and I'm happy to go through this as we start to ask questions. If there are specific questions about the budget or supplemental docs, this was not one of the high priorities when I asked that poll earlier. So I'm going to end with my parting words here. And so this is my grant writing wisdom. Never confuse a grant with real life. That's what I tell people all the time. You always want to present the truth, but it doesn't mean that you have to be absolutely exhaustive. You really want to focus on structuring a convincing argument. And similarly, you're budgeting for an ideal where you can hire on day 1, no one ever quits, every participant participates in every single activity, and that's okay, that's normal. Even though I know you can't hire on day 1, or I know someone might quit, never confuse a grant with real life. And the reviewers, reminder, do not know your organization or your community. They don't know you, and you need to tell them. Even though you might know some of them, you're probably not going to know all of them. And so that's why I say never confuse a grant with real life. All right, one more poll, and then we're going to do Q&A here. Did you learn something about grant writing today? All right, Candace, if we've got enough folks responding, let's see. Let's see if they're not. Okay, that's pretty good. I like that. Yes, a lot. Yes, somewhat, a little. No one said no. So you know what? Celebrate. All right. I mean, that's fantastic. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to start now with Q&A. I'm going to take my slides down, although I can't see you, but you'll just see a bigger version of me. Okay, and I'm going to ask Kathy. I saw Q&A flying in, and I'm hoping you can help direct me to the most common questions or widest in application. What will people be interested in? Go ahead, Kathy. Kick me off here in Q&A.
Okay, the number 1 question, the one question that we got the most the most questions about is, will a copy of this recording be shared? And how to get copies of the slides, or the PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah, sure. So I think Candace or some of her teammates are going to be sharing that information. Candace has a copy of my slides. And so Candace, if you can let people know when they can expect to receive a copy, and I'm happy to send you some of that additional documentation that I was describing.
Sure. So copies will be available online sometime next week. So it's going to include the recording and the material from today.
Okay. And let's see. We did get a question about how does the House Appropriations application process work?
The appropriations process.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is the 30 seconds that I did at the very beginning, where I described how the agencies put forward a budget request, OMB consolidates, they put together the president's request, and then that goes out to the appropriations committees and they discuss and debate for a long time. And so individuals and those representing organizations don't get involved in that process. That's a part of the federal process.
Okay, and as we write grants, could we save our work? Then after several applications have been submitted, could we use a tool such as Chat GPT to sort through those previous applications to complete applications for future grants without bad data being collected from the web at large that would put erroneous information into the application?
So I am not an AI expert, but I have dabbled in seeing how I could use it myself and seeing how it might perform with some of those questions that you might ask it. And I think there are very targeted areas that you might be able to use Chat GPT for, or a similar large language tool like Bard or something like that. It has to be pretty targeted. You have to be really good at prompting it. I would not in any way expect it to write a full grant application. No matter how much material you give it, I highly doubt that's going to happen. And I think that the NIH, for example, moved to restrict the use of a tool like ChatGPT in reviews, for example. So there's definitely some hesitancy from the federal agencies. But if you asked it to, I'll give you an example of a way I have used it. I had bios for individuals that I was working with, and they were too long. They were like 300 words, and I had space for like 100 words per person. And so I asked a tool like ChatGPT, can you take this bio and consolidate it so it's only 100 words? I asked it to cut down words. It did a pretty good job of that. If you had I'm not sure, I haven't used it for certain things. So I think my example is a realistic way of how you might be able to use it. I don't think you'd be able to serve it several grant applications and ask it to write a whole one on its own. Not with what we have available right now.
Okay, what is the website for accessing the transcript of this session?
Candace is going to post it soon. She's
Okay.
going to send you an email, I think. Candace, you tell me if that's wrong.
Yes, that's right. So it will be online. I'll post it in the chat as well so everybody can see it.
The forms, templates, not the PowerPoints, will those be on the site also or emailed to us?
Yeah, I have to send those to Candace and then she'll post it.
Are there any books on grant writing that you might recommend?
No. I think the way that many people have learned grant writing is to do it. And it's one of those things that you can get a primer like this, but then it really takes having a live opportunity and going through the full process of deciding to apply and crafting your narrative to really feel like you've got it. You have to kind of go through it to do it. I have not found any books that I've loved.
Okay, can you touch on writing the budget also?
Yeah, sure. So I'll re-pull up my slides here because I do have a slide on the budget, but that was not a hot item. So I didn't get too far into that. Okay, the budget here. These are the categories that are most often found in federal budgets. No federal budget looks exactly like this, but because some of the budgets don't have every single one of these categories. But there are some that are very common. Like you almost always have personnel and fringe and travel, supplies. Sometimes you don't have equipment. You usually have contractual or subaward, or at least it's on the budget template. Whether or not you're allowed to use it would depend on the agency. And then we get into some of the other things. There's a few like participant costs, construction, a fee, which is only for SBIR, STTRs for the for-profit small business entity. Those aren't on every single federal budget. They're a little bit tailored to the agency. Many of these are fairly self-explanatory. Your salary is the person's salary who's going to be filling a particular role and what percentage of their effort they're going to be committing. So, you might have somebody who gets $60,000 salary and they're going to put 10% of their effort on this project. And so you have $6,000 being charged to the grant. Fringe benefits is usually calculated by your organization's accountant or someone similar in that kind of finance role for your organization. Travel, you usually want to use the GSA rates, gsa.gov there to estimate things like flight mileage, hotel, per diem, ground transportation. Equipment is usually only for things that are greater than $5,000. Your computer is not usually classified as equipment. You want to look at that agency's particular guidelines that will be listed in the solicitation, as well as probably generically on their website. Supplies are smaller things, laptops, paper, ink cartridges, other things like that you may need, giveaways or incentives for participants, contracts, consultants, subawards. If you're engaging another organization or another singular person, you might use those lines. And ultimately, you add all that up, and then there's an indirect rate taken on that, which is also called facilities and administration. Most organizations that have gone through federal funding before would have an indirect cost rate agreement or a NICRA, a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. You apply that rate that you have been assigned after negotiation with one of the federal agencies. DHHS is the most common to hold those agreements. You can also apply what's called the minimus rate, which is 10%. Any organization can apply 10%, or you can calculate it when you are, and that you probably want to work with your finance team at your organization to figure out what is the best route there, what's available to you on that. Then when you come to the justification, this is a good point that I always like to explain. The budget justification, it's always called that, but it really should be budget explanation, because you are not in that portion of the document trying to justify your costs. You're really just trying to show your math and explain them. And so just like I did with that personnel, they make 60,000, you want to use them for 10% time on this particular project, you're going to request 6,000 for personnel costs. That's it. You're showing your math. It's usually 1 or 2 pages, even for very large budgets. There are plenty of budgets that I have seen that are over $10 million, and the budget justification is less than 2 pages. Because you're really showing your math. You're not introducing any new information. You're not trying to convince anybody of anything. You're really just explaining what those costs are. We're back to Kathy.
There are a lot of questions about whether an individual should hire somebody to write a grant, or if they should attempt to write a grant proposal on their own. And if they should attempt to do it, are there any organizations or individuals who they could contract with, or I guess maybe acquire to review the grant prior to submitting?
Gotcha. So that is a question where it depends. So there are some organizations that will never have enough funding to hire an external grant writer. And then there are other times where you almost can't afford not to hire. Asked the small consulting firm that I worked for to write their service area competition, that SAC grant, because it is essential to their functioning as an FQHC. If they lost that grant, if someone competed against them and they lost it, or they weren't approved as the award recipient to continue, they would lose their 330 base grant, and then they would lose their enhanced billing to CMS. That would put them out of business. They would no longer be an FQHC. So they were highly incentivized to make sure that a group of people who had extensive experience writing service area competitions worked with them. So that's that one side where it's almost, you almost have to pay a consultant or similar to make sure that you stay in business as an organization. And then there are many instances that people do not use a grant writer for. There are some small firms, there are some individuals, everyone has different types of expertise. And I think a great place to start is to identify organizations that hold a grant from the same organization, same agency that you want to get a grant from, and start asking around. Ask those awardees, hey, did you work with anybody on producing this grant? Was there any grant writer working with you? I'd love to talk to them. And that's how you're probably going to generate the best leads for you. Grant writers, I would say, easily cost $300. That's the higher side per hour. And on the lower side, it's probably low side is 100. Maybe you can find someone to do it for 75 an hour. And depending on the size of the application, it could take 100 to 400 hours. So that's a significant amount of money.
Does partnering with local government or quasi-government increase the chance for being awarded a grant?
Totally depends. So there would be instances where a local government or similar would not be eligible to participate in a grant application. And then there are others where it would be absolutely advantageous. So we have faculty from Emory and Georgia Tech that are collaborating with MARTA on particular projects, and in which case MARTA has to be a part of the actual project for it to work. But then there's plenty of other types of proposals that it wouldn't be an automatic value add, and it might actually be prohibited. So it's very dependent on the particular program to which you're applying and the work that you want to do.
Can you explain more about evaluation function requirement? Who can perform this work?
So some agencies have a very specific requirement that it be an external evaluator, and then others do not have any expectation or requirement that the evaluator be outside of the organization, as long as there's some kind of arm's length distance. And it might be, I think for service grants, a lot of times the evaluation hinges on the evaluation plan that is written in the proposal, and there's less emphasis on who is performing the evaluation. And so it's really about finding a person who can write a very strong evaluation plan and then follow up on it.
Please provide more information regarding the advantage or disadvantages of lead versus compete.
Sure. So if you're leading, you are the head organization that is actually submitting the proposal. You are managing the overall budget. You're doing the overall reporting, and you can sub to an organization that's going to do a part of the work. And the organization that's going to do a part of the work is often only providing certain aspects of the work and is only providing documents and language that relates to their particular organization and what their scope of work is. And there may be multiple subawards. As if you go in as a subaward, your fate is entirely tied to the lead organization. if the lead organization goofs and adds an extra page when there's a strict page limit, you're out of the running. Everything's done. Depending on how your organization captures and advertises success in grant seeking, you would be describing a partnership if you're not in the lead always. You'd always be saying, we partnered with another organization to obtain a portion of a larger grant. And whereas at the lead, you kind of get to say, yeah, this is all yours. And you will often talk about your subawardee partners, but you're not really beholden to doing so. So different organizations are sometimes incentivized to be the lead because they want to be the one championing their own proposed project. And then other times that might be less important to be in front, and your organization might be very satisfied with having a portion of the funds and doing a portion of the work because you still get to do really positive things with the advancing your organization's mission. Emory, for example, is often the lead and often a subawardee. We really do both.
Okay, there's two questions here that are pretty common. Are there more than just government grants? How can we access them? And is there a difference in service grants and federal grants?
Okay, so because this grant talked about specifically writing for federal grants, that's what we were focused on, but there are grants at the state level, there's private grants from foundations, as well as sometimes industry. And then there's philanthropy, which can sometimes support projects that are also grant supported, but philanthropy would not be considered a grant, it would be considered a gift, but it's often can be tied to similar programs or supporting the same kinds of programs. And so many organizations have a mix of those sources. Federal agencies definitely support services. So for example, HRSA and the HRSA proposal or solicitation that we looked at, that is really a service type of grant. It's not a research grant, it's not a training grant. It's a service grant. And there are many service grants that are supported by HRSA, SAMHSA, CDC. Those are some of the big ones where a lot of dollars come from for services, but there's others as well, HUD. Some of the Department of Education might be somewhere in between a service or maybe training, for example. So there are several sources within the federal government.
Okay, regarding 501c3, I hear there is a scaled down application since the application process is what keeps hindering me. I hope this is true. Are you aware of it?
I'm not familiar with that. You'd have to, if you told me the specific agency or format or program that you thought had a scaled down version, I might be able to understand a little better. Off the top of my head, it does not ring any bells. And I'm not aware of small businesses do have a separate program. The application process really isn't that different. There are aspects of it that are different, but small businesses have a separate process. Most of the all of the programs that I am thinking of right now would put 501c3s through the regular process.
RFPs are typically requests for goods and services. Are you stating that there are RFPs to provide funding/grants?
So when I listed a bunch of those names for RFPs, like RFA or program announcement or notice of special interest or dear colleague letter or all sorts of kinds of names. My point was there are many different kinds of names to describe a solicitation, and those names actually mean slightly different things in terms of what type of application they're soliciting. But almost everyone generically talks about it using the term RFP. And many people use that term to describe a broad set of types of solicitations, not just goods and services.
Okay. Let's see. Do you have to have all or any sub companies when you submit a grant?
Say that again?
It says, do you have to have all or any sub companies when you submit a grant? And I'm
Oh.
assuming that they're asking if you're the lead, do you have to have your sub companies?
Usually no, so there's usually not sub-awards or subcontracts as a requirement. Occasionally there is, if it's particularly for supporting a type of partnership where both partners are expected to get portions of the funding. That sometimes happens in some niche programs, but generally, no, you don't have to have a sub-award. If you can do it all yourself and there's no requirement for external evaluation, then you don't need any sub-awards.
Is it possible to share a sample? I think they're saying sample reduced grant proposal that was actually funded.
Yes, probably. And so those are all accessible through the Freedom of Information Act if you really needed to use that mechanism. But many organizations, because they are potentially accessible in that way, will provide you with a copy of a funded application. It's only for funded, not for unfunded, but we'll provide you with a copy if you ask nicely. And so my suggestion would be, if you're looking to see a copy of one, to ask an organization that has received something similar, and then see if they'll hand that over to you, because it is technically, you can FOIA it if you really need to. All right, I think that's all the time we have for questions. I was so delighted to talk with you all today, and I really appreciate the Congressman's office organizing this. And I think Candace shared the link recently, or is about to. So I'm so glad. There's so many questions. Thank you very much.
I think it's my turn. This is Marcus Garza. I'm the Congressman's Chief of Staff in our Washington, D.C. office. I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. As the Congressman mentioned at the top of the hour, this week is about taking care of home first. This week of action, which the Congressman has affectionately dubbed our Week of Hope, is dedicated to recognizing your immense work on the ground in communities across the district and how we can be of service to you. We appreciate your invaluable partnership in serving the people of Georgia's 4th Congressional District and look forward to continuing our work, important work together. We hope you found today's presentation information on how to write a grant proposal to be helpful. A special thank you to our presenter, Ms. Kimberly Jo Eck from Emory University, for sharing her wonderful tips on drafting a grant proposal. Finally, just a reminder to join us again tomorrow at 1 p.m. sharp for part 2 of our grants workshop, which will focus on tips for submitting a successful application. We will be joined by Mr. Charles Sperling, the Executive Director of STAND Incorporated, and Mr. Kyle Bryant, a Senior Environmental Justice Specialist with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Additionally, each presentation from our 4-day grant workshop will be recorded, and all the materials will be shared on our House website, hankjohnson.house.gov, under the Serving You tab at the very top of the website sometime next week. With that, this concludes today's presentation. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you soon.